As recently as 50 years ago, the United Kingdom was a global superpower, a place of opportunity, stability, growth, and prosperity. But today it feels like the very fabric of British life is unraveling, and everything is constantly getting worse for the British people. Rising costs, stagnant wages, crumbling infrastructure, and an uncertain future have left millions of Britons wondering what happened to the country they once knew. Why does it feel like something is sucking the soul out of the United Kingdom? In this video, we're going to take a look at the harsh realities facing modern Britain and uncover how these compounding crises are pushing the nation to its breaking point. When starting off, it is difficult to pick the most urgent crisis that the UK is facing, as it is currently facing so many of them simultaneously that it is impossible to pick one. The story of the UK in the 21st century is that of a fundamental economic imbalance created by years of poor policy decisions that have driven up costs, devalued incomes, and hampered economic growth. This isn't just a simple case of inflation, but a full blown economic crisis. To truly explain why everything in the UK feels so bad nowadays, we must discuss everything from the energy crisis, the housing shortage, mass immigration, Brexit, deindustrialization, and everything in between. So strap yourselves in because this is going to be a deep dive. One of the most glaring failures is in the energy sector. The UK's push towards renewable energy, while having noble intentions, has been implemented in a way that has worsened the already present energy crisis. Britain has rapidly transitioned away from coal, shutting down coal-fired power plants in the name of going green, but without adequately replacing them. Instead of investing heavily in nuclear energy or ensuring a steady transition to renewables, the government has left a massive gap in the energy grid, forcing Britain to import vast amounts of energy. As a result, Britain has become heavily reliant on this imported energy, especially natural gas. And when global energy markets experience disruptions, like during the war in Ukraine or the 2019 pandemic, the United Kingdom feels the shock far more than a nation like France, which produces most of its energy through nuclear power. Energy prices soar because the country no longer has a stable domestic energy supply to fall back on. At the same time, renewable energy sources like wind and solar are not, unlike fossil fuels or nuclear energy, yet reliable enough to meet the country's energy demands, especially during times of low wind or sunlight. The government's closure of coal plants has also left industries that rely on cheap energy, such as steel production, on the brink of collapse. The British steel industry, once a backbone of the economy, has been decimated and is barely hanging on. Why? Well, simply because it's impossible for energy intensive industries like steel production to remain competitive when electricity costs in the UK are among the highest in Europe. Britain now imports the majority of its steel and is no longer capable of producing virgin steel, which not only damages local industries but leaves the nation strategically vulnerable in a potential crisis and completely reliant on foreign suppliers for a critical material. But the crisis doesn't end there. The UK's reliance on foreign energy has made it highly vulnerable to external price shocks. In 2021, global gas prices surged due to a combination of supply shortages, geopolitical tensions, and increased demand as economies rebounded with the pandemic. British households saw their energy bills skyrocket, with many paying nearly double for their gas and electricity compared to just a few years prior. This has plunged millions into fuel poverty, a grim situation where families are forced to choose between heating their homes or putting food on the table. At the same time, renewable energy hasn't provided the safety net many had hoped for. While offshore wind farms and solar panels have been expanded, they're not yet reliable enough to serve as the primary energy source for the UK. Wind power, for example, is intermittent, depending on weather conditions that are far from predictable. During periods of low wind, the energy grid is forced to rely even more on costly natural gas imports. Solar power faces similar limitations, particularly in a country like the UK, where sunshine is scarce for large parts of the year. And this isn't simply something that can be fixed overnight, as there's nothing we can do to change wind speed or make the sun shine harder. And as the UK switched more of its energy production to unreliable sources of clean energy, it will be forced to import more and more natural gas to compensate for shortages during low production periods. The government has placed its bets on these renewable sources without ensuring that the infrastructure can support them or that backup energy supplies like nuclear are in place. For example, nuclear energy, which is both low carbon and reliable, has been woefully underfunded and underdeveloped in the UK. As an example, Hinkley Point C, the first new nuclear power station in over 20 years, is years behind schedule and billions over budget. Even when completed, it will only provide a fraction of the nation's energy needs, and other planned nuclear projects have been stalled or canceled entirely. The energy crisis has created a vicious cycle where high energy prices drive up production costs across the board, which is ultimately passed on to consumers as prices of everything are forced to increase. This further deepens the cost of living crisis, with everyday essentials like food, transportation, and heating becoming increasingly unaffordable for many households. British manufacturing has also suffered, as industries that rely heavily on energy, like chemicals, glass, and cement, and already mentioned steel, face spiraling costs, making it difficult for them to compete globally. The UK's energy policy has failed to provide the balance between sustainability and reliability. The rapid abandonment of coal without adequately ramping up of nuclear and renewable production has left the nation exposed to global energy market fluctuations. Without urgent reforms, Britain risks falling deeper into an energy crisis where businesses struggle to stay afloat, consumers face unaffordable energy bills, and the nation's economic competitiveness is severely weakened more than it already is. The second piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding the UK's decline is its housing affordability and shortage crisis. The UK is kind of notorious for its housing crisis all around the world. It's basic common knowledge that nobody, especially young people, can afford to own a home or a flat in the UK. But that wasn't always the case. What was once a country where home ownership was attainable for the average person has now become a place where even renting a modest flat in a major city is difficult. The roots of this crisis run deep, back to even the end of the Second World War, with decades of government mismanagement, restrictive development laws, and a failure to build enough housing, both private and especially public. The first policy problem is that the government almost completely abandoned the construction of public housing. During the post Second World War era, public housing was a central pillar of British society. Councils were building hundreds of thousands of homes each year, providing housing for working class families. This kept housing markets relatively stable and helped mitigate the effects of inflation on home prices. However, since the 1980s, there's been a dramatic shift. The right to buy scheme introduced by Margaret Thatcher allowed council tenants to purchase their homes at a discount, which led to a significant reduction in public housing stock. But what the government failed to do was replace the homes that were sold off. As public housing construction slowed to a trickle, the supply of affordable homes dwindled. In 1977, local authorities built over 100,000 council homes. By 2020, that number had fallen to just a few thousand. This by itself wouldn't really be a problem, as the private sector would have picked up the slack. In fact, the government had expected it to do so, but it hasn't. The problem was that the government stopped building public housing, but didn't ease up on massive restrictions that it put on the private sector in the meantime. The government made it nearly impossible for private developers to build at the scale necessary to meet the country's growing demand for housing. One of the most significant barriers to housing development in the UK is its Green Belt policy. Established in the 1950s to prevent urban sprawl and preserve the countryside, these designated green zones now cover nearly 13% of England's land. While protecting green spaces is important, these zones often include land that could be used for housing, particularly around major cities where demand is highest. When an average person hears about these green zones, they think of something else. But instead, these green zones are hardly green, and sometimes in the middle of cities looking like this. In cities like London, where the housing crisis is most acute, greenbelt land surrounds much of the urban area, making it incredibly difficult for developers to build new homes where they are needed most. As a result, housing supply in urban areas has not kept pace with population growth, driving prices skyward. For instance, in London, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment now sits at around £1,800 per month, which is more than 60% of the average renter's take-home pay. Compare this to the 1970s, when average rents were just 10 to 15% of monthly income adjusted for inflation. Another major issue is how easy it is for individuals or local groups to shut down new developments. The UK's planning system is notorious for being slow, bureaucratic, and heavily influenced by local opposition. Even when developers manage to secure planning permissions, projects can be delayed or blocked entirely by NIMBYism, the not in my backyard mentality that has become pervasive across the country. A single objection from a local resident or community group can halt a project for years, and this has severely limited the number of new homes being built. It simply doesn't pay off for developers to build housing if their investments can be halted for years because of a random complaint that might not even be legitimate. In 2018, it was estimated that 40% of residential planning applications in London were either delayed or rejected, often due to local opposition. This has created a situation where the supply of housing is artificially constrained and demand continues to outstrip availability, leading once again to rising prices. Another way that the government is worsening the housing crisis is its complex and overly strict building regulations. While these regulations are often intended to ensure quality and environmental sustainability, they have the unintended consequence of stifling development. The costs of compliance with regulations are so high that many developers either pass these costs on to buyers, further driving up prices, or abandon projects altogether. It's not uncommon for housing developments to take 7 to 10 years from conception to completion due to the slow moving planning process and regulatory hurdles, which is ridiculous. Who in their right mind would invest their money into something that has a high likelihood of being stalled, constrained, taking up to 10 years, and not even being all that profitable in the end, when they can just invest into a different country that welcomes their investment? For example, affordable housing quotas, while well intentioned, often force developers to allocate a percentage of new builds to lower cost homes. However, this increases the overall cost of development, which can make entire projects financially unfeasible. As a result, many developers opt to build fewer homes, and when they do, they often prioritize luxury developments that aren't so overly restricted and burdened by regulations that they can offer higher returns, leaving affordable housing on an even shorter supply. A fact that helps illustrate just how little has been built over the years in the UK is that the average age of a house or apartment is 60 to 70 years old, and most housing has been built between the 1930s and 1960s. The consequences of this housing shortage are wide reaching. Renters are now trapped in a situation where rent eats up the majority of their take home pay, and many are trapped in a cycle where they cannot save enough to purchase a home, yet their rent continues to increase, leaving them wondering whether they'd have been better off as peasants under Henry VIII. The Office for National Statistics, the ONS, reports that the average rent in England has risen by nearly 50% in the last decade, far outpacing wage growth. The government has responded with rent caps and subsidies, but these measures are only attempts to mask the bigger issue that there simply aren't enough homes to go around and are making the situation even worse. If you're curious how exactly rent controls damage the housing market, be sure to watch our other video about it after you're done watching this one, as the link will be in the pinned comment. For buyers, especially first-time buyers, the situation is not much better. Rising home prices have pushed many out of the market entirely. According to the Nationwide Building Society, the average house price in the UK reached £260,000 in 2021, which is about 10 years of an average person's income. Even with government schemes like Help to Buy, the requirement for a large deposit, typically 10 to 20% of the home's value, makes it impossible for many people to step onto the property ladder. In the 1970s, the average home cost roughly 3 to 4 times the average salary. Today, that number is closer to 10 times the average salary, with prices in cities like London being even higher. Home ownership has become only a pipe dream for many younger generations. For millennials and Gen Z, the idea of owning a home is increasingly out of reach as house prices continue to climb at an unsustainable rate. This housing crisis has exacerbated wealth inequality across the UK. Those fortunate enough to own property have seen their wealth skyrocket as house prices continue to rise. Meanwhile, those renting, particularly the already mentioned younger generations, are locked out of the housing market and are unable to build the same wealth through property ownership. The result is a generational divide where older, wealthier homeowners are accumulating more wealth, while the younger people are increasingly stuck in expensive rental markets, unable to save or invest. The UK's housing system is no longer one that promotes upward mobility. Instead, it traps people in cycles of poverty and financial insecurity. The UK's housing affordability crisis is a result of decades of government inaction, restrictive regulations, and an over reliance on outdated planning laws. The failure to build both public and private housing has left the country with an acute shortage, driving up prices and leaving millions of Britons unable to afford a place to live. Without significant reforms, the UK's housing market will continue to spiral out of control, further deepening the wealth divide and eroding the quality of life for future generations. We can't talk about the troubles the UK has been through recently without mentioning Brexit. The story of Brexit is one of unintended consequences and a profound miscalculation by British political leaders. In itself, the idea of leaving the EU is not terrible. In fact, there are many countries which are extremely prosperous without being in the EU. However, the way it was handled in the United Kingdom was a result of pure incompetence, negligence, or just sheer indifference. In 2016, when the then Prime Minister David Cameron called for a referendum on whether the UK should leave the European Union, it was largely seen as a political maneuver to placate Eurosceptics within his own Conservative Party. The proposal itself was never meant to pass. Most political insiders and indeed the British government expected the Remain side to win comfortably. But in a stunning upset, 51.9% of voters chose to leave the EU, sending shockwaves through the UK and the rest of Europe. Cameron, who had campaigned for Remain, promptly resigned in the wake of the referendum, leaving the country with no clear plan for how to proceed. It soon became apparent that not only was there no strategy for how to leave the EU, but the government hadn't fully understood the potential economic repercussions for doing so. What followed was years of political chaos as successive governments struggled to figure out how to extricate the UK from the EU without causing irreparable damage to its economy and global standing. The first of many issues was the length of time it took to actually implement Brexit. Despite the referendum taking place in June of 2016, the UK didn't officially leave the European Union until January 31st, 2020, nearly 4 years later. In that time, the country witnessed an almost revolving door of prime ministers, each whom grappled with the complex task of negotiating the UK's exit from the EU, often with disastrous consequences for economic stability and public confidence. Theresa May, who succeeded David Cameron, spent much of her premiership trying to negotiate a Brexit deal that would satisfy both the EU and her deeply divided parliament. Her tenure was marked by endless parliamentary deadlock, failed votes, and growing frustration across the political spectrum. The infamous backstop, a mechanism designed to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, became a sticking point that ultimately led to May's inability to pass her version of the Brexit deal. After multiple defeats in Parliament, the humiliation of the 2017 snap election, in which the Conservatives lost their majority, May was forced to resign in 2019. Enter Boris Johnson, a staunch Brexiteer who promised to get Brexit done. Johnson's approach was far more confrontational, and he managed to secure a deal by the end of 2019, which led to the UK's formal exit from the EU in early 2020. But while Brexit was now legally complete, the economic fallout was only just beginning, and the terms of the deal left much to be desired. Trade negotiations were rushed, critical issues like fishing rights and financial services were inadequately addressed, and the promise of taking back control felt hollow as businesses struggled to adapt to new trade barriers. One of the key arguments for Brexit was that the UK would regain its sovereignty and be free to negotiate its own trade deals with the rest of the world. However, this promise was quickly undermined by the sheer complexity of untangling the UK from decades of EU regulations and trade agreements. The EU had been the UK's largest trading partner, accounting for nearly 50% of all UK exports prior to Brexit. Leaving the EU meant leaving the single market and customs union, which suddenly introduced tariffs, customs checks, and regulatory barriers that hadn't existed before, raising costs of doing business significantly for both partners and raising the price of EU goods in the UK and UK goods inside of the EU. And so, as expected, exports to the EU became far more costly and time consuming, with small and medium sized businesses hit particularly hard. Many exporters found themselves facing mountains of paperwork, delayed shipments, and unexpected costs, with some even ceasing trade with the EU entirely. British fishermen, one of the groups that had been promised significant gains from Brexit, found themselves locked out of EU markets or facing reduced quotas, while the much touted new trade deals with countries like the US and Japan either failed to materialize or offered little economic benefit. At the same time, the UK's financial services sector, which represents a significant portion of the economy, was largely left out of the Brexit trade deal. London, previously the financial capital of Europe, lost much of its access to the European market. Major banks and financial institutions began relocating parts of their operations to Paris, Frankfurt, and Dublin, draining jobs and investments from the UK. According to reports by Ernst& Young, Brexit cost the UK's financial sector over £1 trillion in assets that were transferred to other European cities. The overall effect on trade has been stark. UK exports to the EU dropped by 15% in the first year following Brexit, while imports from the EU fell by 25%. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, estimates that Brexit will reduce the UK's GDP by 4% over the long term, a significant hit to an economy already reeling from the COVID-19 pandemic. For the average Briton, the economic fallout of Brexit has been felt most acutely in rising costs of living and shrinking opportunities. Food prices, for example, have been particularly hard hit. The UK relies heavily on food imports from the EU, and the introduction of customs checks and tariffs have increased the cost of everything, from fresh produce to dairy products. Supermarket prices have risen, and supply chain disruptions have become more common. Some estimates suggest that food prices in the UK would rise by as much as 6% due to Brexit related trade barriers alone. This proved to be even worse than was initially predicted, as food prices are a whopping 25% higher in 2024 than they were in 2020, with some categories of food being even higher. The prices of vegetables, which were largely imported from the EU, rose by as much as 39%. Beyond food, the broader economy has also suffered. Sectors like manufacturing, which are dependent on integrated European supply chains, have struggled with increasing costs and delays. The automotive industry, for instance, has seen factories closing or reducing production as companies like Honda and Nissan scale back their operations in the UK. The loss of foreign investment has also been notable, with major firms that once saw the UK as a gateway to the EU now relocating their operations to mainland Europe. As if the economic uncertainty wasn't enough, the political instability of the Brexit years took a significant toll on public confidence and national morale. The constant leadership changes from David Cameron to Theresa May, and finally to Boris Johnson, followed by Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and now Keir Starmer, left the UK without clear direction for years. The confusion surrounding the terms of Brexit, compounded by frequent political scandals, left many feeling that their leaders were not only incompetent, but entirely disconnected from their struggles of ordinary people. As a result, wages have stagnated, investments in key sectors have dried up, and opportunities for economic growth have been severely limited. For younger generations in particular, Brexit has closed off opportunities that previous generations took for granted, such as the ability to study, work, and live freely across the EU. This has left many feeling disillusioned, with polls showing that the majority of young people regret the decision to leave the EU. The post Brexit economic fallout has left the UK in a permanent state of uncertainty. While the promise of a more prosperous, independent Britain was central to the Leave campaign, the reality has been far less optimistic. Instead of gaining control, the UK has found itself in a position where it is constantly renegotiating its relationship with Europe while struggling to maintain its global economic standing. For many Britons, the promise of a better life outside of the EU has not materialized. Instead, they face higher costs, fewer opportunities, and a future where Britain is increasingly isolated on the global stage. But wait, the British leadership's incompetence gets even worse. The UK's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was marked by a series of delayed decisions, massive spending, and inconsistent public health strategies that have left lasting scars on the economy and society. Initially, The government was hesitant in imposing lockdowns, leading to a significant spike in cases during the early stages of the pandemic. Other nations, such as Sweden, avoided lockdowns entirely and reaped the benefits. But the UK's policy was neither here nor there, backflipping from a no lockdown policy to a full lockdown policy, and it somehow got the worst of both worlds. The delayed response forced the UK into longer and more severe lockdowns compared to many other nations. This worsened the economic damage as the country had to endure multiple waves of restrictions to contain the virus. Retail, hospitality, and other service sectors were hit particularly hard, with thousands of businesses closing permanently. According to the Office of National Statistics, or ONS, the UK economy shrank by 9.8% in 2020, which was the sharpest contraction in over 300 years of history. The government's back and forth approach to handling COVID, evidenced by abrupt shifts in lockdown policies, sudden reopenings, and mixed messages, undermined public confidence. Moreover, costly ventures such as the failed NHS test and trace system, $37 billion, not only fell short in curbing the spread of the virus, but also drained valuable public resources. The UK's vaccination rollout was also a mixed bunch too, yet it came after severe economic damage had already been done. Millions were pushed into poverty, and entire industries such as live entertainment, air travel, and tourism were left devastated. What's even worse, in response to the crisis, the UK government rolled out unprecedented stimulus measures such as the furlough scheme and financial aid packages. These policies came at a very high price. The government spent £70 billion on furlough alone, and overall pandemic-related costs surged past £370 billion. While these measures provided immediate relief, they also significantly increased the national debt, which ballooned to over 100% of GDP by 2021. This debt would become a long-term burden, constraining public spending and adding pressure to the economy in the years to come. As part of the government's economic response, the Bank of England engaged in extensive quantitative easing, effectively printing hundreds of billions of pounds to buy government bonds and stimulate the economy. While this injection of cash helped stave off immediate collapse due to extremely high spending that we already mentioned, it laid the groundwork for future economic problems, especially inflation. The sharp increase in the money supply combined with the post-pandemic supply chain disruptions created the perfect storm for rising prices. This leads us directly into the next crisis: inflation and currency devaluation. Let's break down how exactly the pandemic response fed into the soaring inflation that the UK is grappling with today. The massive money printing during the COVID-19 pandemic was a double-edged sword. While quantitative easing and financial support helped keep the UK economy from collapsing under the weight of lockdowns, it also significantly increased the money supply, setting the stage for the current inflationary crisis. Between 2020 and 2021, the Bank of England injected over £450 billion into the economy. Initially, this helped maintain liquidity and allowed the government to borrow at low rates. However, as global economies reopened and demand surged, the oversupply of money began to push prices up across the board. As we already have talked about on this channel, money can be looked at as a commodity or good like any other, and follows the same laws of supply and demand. Thus, the more money there is in circulation, i.e. the higher the supply, without an increase in demand, i.e. without significant GDP growth, the less value money becomes and prices soar. And prices have soared. As of 2024, inflation has grown to levels not seen in decades. The UK's inflation rate peaked at 11.1% in late 2022, driven by skyrocketing energy costs, food price increases, and supply chain disruptions. While global factors like the energy crisis played a role, the sheer volume of money injected into the economy by the Bank of England has been a key driver of domestic inflation. The surge in demand for goods and services, coupled with supply shortages, created the perfect conditions for inflation to spiral. While the official inflation rate peaked at 11.1%, many commodities like food and groceries saw even higher increases. As mentioned earlier, food prices alone have risen by 25% since 2020, and the cost of housing and utilities have further squeezed the average citizen's budget. The UK's reliance on imports post-Brexit have also worsened the situation, as additional tariffs and trade barriers have driven up the cost of everyday goods, too. Inflation has also eroded the value of the British pound internationally. The pound is weakened against other global currencies like the US dollar and the euro. A weaker pound increased the cost of imports, further fueling inflation. For a country that relies heavily on imported goods and energy, this devaluation only worsens the cost of living crisis for the average person. To make things even worse, while prices have soared, wages have not kept pace with inflation. Many workers have experienced real wage declines, as pay increases have been insufficient to cover the rising cost of living. Sectors such as healthcare, education, and transportation have seen strikes and protests as workers demand better pay to offset inflation's impact on their disposable income. The combination of money printing, weak currency, and the UK's economic fragility has created an inflationary spiral that shows no signs of abating, leaving millions of British citizens struggling to maintain their standard of living. As you can probably see by the length of this video, we aren't even close to done, and now it's time to rip apart the UK's public services, which were once seen as a model for the world, are now buckling under years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and the strains of rising demand. From healthcare to education to transportation, the decline in service quality is having a devastating impact on the day-to-day lives of citizens, contributing to a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. The National Health Service, NHS, long a source of national pride, is currently facing its worst crisis in decades. Chronic underfunding and severe staffing shortages have led to unbearable pressure on the system and worsened problems that the NHS was already bound to be facing due to being a universal healthcare system. There are shortages of absolutely everything, including workers. According to the British Medical Association, there is a shortage of more than 100,000 healthcare workers across the NHS, including doctors and nurses who are largely leaving for other developed nations such as the US. This shortage, coupled with an aging population and post-pandemic healthcare needs, has caused unprecedented waiting times. By 2023, over 7.6 million people were waiting for routine operations like hip replacements, a figure that has doubled since 2010. The government's spending on the NHS has not kept up with rising costs or the increasing demand for services. In real terms, health spending grew only modestly in the years before the pandemic, and subsequent emergency funding has not been enough to rebuild the system. The COVID-19 response drained significant resources, leaving many hospitals unable to cope with everyday medical demands. In general, universal healthcare systems have many problems which are very hard to address in the first place. But what the UK government has done to the NHS would be the equivalent of injecting 2 grams of antibiotic steroids per week into the same problems. The UK's education system, once a global leader, is also struggling to meet the needs of students and teachers. Years of austerity-driven cuts have left schools with outdated facilities, fewer resources, and overworked staff. According to the Institute for Financial Studies, per-pupil spending in England's schools fell by 9% in real terms between 2010 and 2020, and while some funding has been restored since, it's far from enough to reverse the damage. Teachers, along with nurses and doctors, are leaving the profession in droves due to low pay, high workloads, and the stress of managing larger class sizes. This has had a direct impact on student performance. Meanwhile, the government's focus on privatization in education, such as expanding academies, has created further inequality in school quality. More affluent areas tend to have much better funded schools, while poorer regions are left with crumbling infrastructure and fewer resources, widening the education gap between the rich and the poor. The UK's transportation network, especially its rail system, is another area which public services are rapidly deteriorating. Despite high fares, British Rail is plagued by delays, cancellations, and overcrowding. Privatization was introduced in the early 1990s, but it could hardly be called privatization. Even though the rail is technically privatized, many aspects of it, including the prices of fares, are controlled by the government, effectively handcuffing the private sector and negating the advantages that privatization was supposed to have in the first place. The system is full of inefficiencies that deteriorate the service quality even further. In 2022, train cancellations reached record highs, with some areas like northern England seeing consistent service failures. Roads and public buses are not much better. Local bus services have been cut by 40% in many regions over the past decade, leaving rural and small town residents without reliable transportation. All of this creates a situation where people are more reliant on personal vehicles, which also got significantly more expensive because of ridiculous regulations, laws, and policies which are so outrageous that a 12-year-old could point to the problems with them. UK drivers are hit with multiple charges that make operating a vehicle expensive. One of the most significant is the Vehicle Exercise Duty, or VED, often referred to as road tax. For example, vehicles with CO2 emissions over 225 grams per kilometer, which are often older or larger vehicles, attract a tax rate of up to £2,605, which is becoming increasingly unaffordable for the average Brit. On top of that, if the vehicle costs more than £40,000, there's an additional surcharge of £390 annually for the first 5 years, pushing costs even higher to a total of £3,000. Then there are congestion charges and clean air zone fees. In cities like London, drivers of higher emission vehicles are subject to both the £15 congestion charge and the £12.50 daily ultra low emission charge, or ULEZ fee. This means that for a Range Rover, driving through central London could cost over £27.50 per day in additional charges alone, which could total as much as £7,000 per year if you're driving the vehicle to work and back. Insurance premiums in the UK are among the highest in Europe, and the type of car you drive heavily impacts this cost. Insurance can exceed £1,000 annually, being even more expensive for younger or less experienced drivers. High insurance costs combined with the fact that premiums increase every year have made it difficult for average citizens to keep their cars insured. Even smaller, more affordable cars face rising insurance premiums, and with new regulations like black box insurance that monitors driving behavior, the financial burden of owning and maintaining a vehicle in the UK grows even further. There are many people in the UK today that can barely afford to drive. The United Kingdom. Just let that sink in. Austerity measures since 2010 have hollowed out the funding for all these public services. While the government sought to reduce the national debt following the financial crisis, the cuts were made without significant deregulation that would allow the private sector to step in, and so the needs of the people remain unfulfilled. Now, even as inflation and economic pressures rise, public spending remains inadequate to address the growing needs of healthcare, education, and transportation. Usually, most of the problems described so far are fixable and have been fixed in many other nations throughout history, but none of them faced an obstacle like the UK does in the 21st century. The UK is facing a demographic time bomb. Its population is aging rapidly, with over 18% of the population now over the age of 65. By 2050, this number is projected to increase to 25%. This shift is creating a severe imbalance in the workforce. Fewer working age people are available to support the growing number of retirees, which places enormous pressure on both public services like the NHS and on the economy as a whole. One of the key contributors to this problem is the declining birth rate among native Britons, which has been falling steadily since the 1960s. The fertility rate in the UK is currently around 1.61 children per woman, far below the replacement level of 2.1 needed to sustain a stable population without relying on immigration. Among native Britons, this rate is even slower, signaling a long-term demographic decline. This means that while the population is growing older, there aren't enough young people entering the labor market to replace retiring workers. The consequences of this are already visible. Many industries, including healthcare, manufacturing, and hospitality, are facing serious workforce shortages. The NHS, which is the UK's largest employer, has over 100,000 vacancies, and the shortage of care workers has reached crisis levels. As the population ages, the demand for healthcare services is increasing, but the lack of qualified staff means longer waiting times and reduced quality of care. The Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, predicts that public spending on health and pensions will rise dramatically in the coming decades, creating a financial crisis if something doesn't change, and it doesn't appear like it will anytime soon. Beyond healthcare, industries such as agriculture and construction are also grappling with labor shortages. These sectors rely heavily on manual labor, and without a steady supply of workers, productivity is declining. This shortage of workers has led to wage inflation, which pushes up the cost of goods and services. Businesses are also struggling to remain competitive as they face higher costs and are unable to meet demand. At the same time, with fewer people contributing to the tax base, the government is facing a revenue shortfall that will make it increasingly difficult to fund public services. The government has attempted to address the workforce shortage through various means, including increasing the retirement age and encouraging older workers to remain in the labor market. However, these measures are stopgaps at best and fail to address the root cause of the problem. Without a significant increase in the birth rate or even higher increases in immigration, the UK will continue to face workforce shortages that will cripple its economy. As the UK struggles with an aging population and shrinking workforce, immigration has become one of the most politically contentious yet economically necessary solutions. While immigration has helped to alleviate workforce shortages, it has also led to significant cultural and social tensions, which many native Britons now see as the biggest issue facing their country today. In the past 2 decades, the UK has seen a dramatic increase in immigration, both from within the EU and from countries outside of Europe. This influx of immigration has had a profound impact on the country's economy and social fabric, and it remains one of the most polarizing issues in British politics today. Following the expansion of the European Union in 2004, the UK experienced a wave of immigration from Eastern Europe, particularly from countries like Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. Immigrants from these countries came to the UK in search of better job opportunities and higher wages, often taking jobs in sectors that were struggling to find workers, such as construction, agriculture, and hospitality. These immigrants have been crucial in filling workforce gaps, but their arrival has also sparked widespread concerns about the impact on wages, housing, and public services. While immigration from Eastern Europe was significant, it was dwarfed by the number of immigrants arriving from outside the EU. Large numbers of people from countries in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa have settled in the UK, driven by conflicts, economic hardship, and the UK's historical ties to former colonies. The result has been a transformation of many British towns and cities, where certain areas are now predominantly populated by immigrant communities. In some parts of the country, the percentage of foreign born residents is as high as 30 to 40%, making many Britons panic about their social integration and loss of British identity. The influx of immigrants has had both positive and negative effects. On the one hand, immigration has played a vital role in sectors like healthcare and construction, where the native born population has been unwilling or unable to meet labor demand. The NHS, in particular, relies heavily on foreign born workers, with over 14% of its staff being non UK nationals. Without this immigrant labor, many of the UK's essential services would struggle to function. On the other hand, large scale immigration has also contributed to rising housing prices, stretched public communities, and increased competition for jobs. The Migration Advisory Committee has estimated that immigration has put upward pressure on housing costs, particularly in areas where demand is already high. Additionally, public services like schools and the NHS have struggled to cope with the growing population, leading to longer waiting times and a reduced quality of care. Public backlash against immigration has been fierce, culminating in the already talked about Brexit referendum of 2016, where concerns about uncontrolled EU immigration played a pivotal role in the Leave campaign's victory. Since then, the government has introduced stricter immigration policies aimed at reducing the number of low skilled migrants while still allowing skilled workers to enter. However, these maneuvers have not been enough to fully address the labor shortages caused by the UK's aging population, and UK companies still struggle to find enough workers to fulfill the gaps. The political response to immigration has been mixed. While some politicians have called for stricter border controls and tougher immigration laws, others have argued that the UK needs to remain open to immigration in order to maintain its workforce and keep the economy functioning. The debate over immigration is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon, and it remains one of the most divisive issues in the country, culminating in bursts of violence like the 2024 UK riots caused by anti immigration sentiments that were building up for a while and were triggered by a mass stabbing of British children in Southport. As much as some Britons won't like to admit, immigration has been both a blessing and a curse for the UK. It has provided much needed labor in crucial sectors, but it also has massive side effects, such as the issue of integrating immigrants into British society and culture. And the only way to truly solve the crisis without collapsing the economy is for Britons to start having way more kids than they currently are, which is unlikely to happen. And so tensions are likely to continue increasing until they reach a boiling point. One of the most alarming issues that the UK is facing is the sheer volume of personal and public debt. Actually, that feels pretty redundant to say since all of these issues can fall under one of the most alarming issues that the UK is facing. Household debt and government borrowing have both soared in recent years, creating a financial burden that will weigh down the country for decades to come. At the individual level, personal debt in the UK is at record highs. In 2023, total household debt reached over 1.8 trillion pounds, driven by mortgages, credit card debt, and personal loans. The Bank of England reported that the average household now holds approximately 60,000 pounds in debt, which is crazy when you compare it to median income levels. The mortgage market is one of the main contributors to personal debt. Rising housing prices combined with stagnant wage growth have forced people to borrow larger sums of money just to secure a home. The average house price in the UK increases by 68% over the last decade, while real wages have grown at a fraction of that rate. As of 2023, the average house in the UK costs around £286,000, while the average salary remains around £31,000. This has pushed the loan to income ratio for many first time buyers well beyond sustainable levels, leading to increased risk and volatility in the housing market. Credit card and personal loan debt have also surged. Britons owed over £72 billion in credit card debt by the end of 2023, with the average household carrying around £2,500 in unpaid balances. This is a significant increase from previous years, partially driven by rising inflation and cost of living pressures, which have forced more people to rely on credit to meet everyday expenses. While interest rates on credit cards often exceed 20%, many Britons now find themselves trapped in a cycle of debt, unable to pay off their balances as the UK is slowly becoming a nation of debt slaves. On the public side, government debt has reached levels not seen since the aftermath of World War II. In 2024, the UK's national debt surpassed £2.6 trillion, amounting to more than 100% of GDP. The sharp increase in borrowing began during the 2008 financial crisis, but it accelerated dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic when the government introduced massive stimulus packages and support measures to keep the economy afloat. Government borrowing was essential to prevent a full-scale economic collapse during the pandemic, but it has left the country with a debt burden that will take decades to pay down. The UK's public sector net borrowing peaked at £303 billion in 2020, and although it has since fallen, the government is still running a substantial deficit, borrowing tens of billions annually just to cover day-to-day expenses. One of the main reasons for the spiraling public debt is the government's reliance on debt financing. Instead of balancing the budget, successive governments have chosen to borrow money to fund public services, infrastructure projects, and welfare programs. This strategy has been politically expedient, but has created long term financial risks. Servicing the national debt already costs the government over £100 billion per year in interest payments alone, a figure that is expected to rise as global interest rates increase. The situation is compounded by the fact that a significant portion of the UK's debt is held by foreign investors, meaning that a large share of interest payments leaves the country. Additionally, the UK's credit rating has been downgraded in recent years, which could make it more expensive for the government to borrow money in the future. High levels of personal and public debt create several challenges for the UK economy. For individuals, rising debt means the household has less disposable income to spend on goods and services, which weakens consumer demand and slows economic growth. For the government, high debt levels restrict fiscal flexibility. With so much of the budget being used to service debt, there's less money available to invest in public services, infrastructure, or to respond to future crises. Increased debt also makes the UK economy more vulnerable to external shocks. If global interest rates rise sharply or if the UK faces another financial crisis, the country could struggle to meet its debt obligations, leading to cuts in public services or higher taxes. To put the nail in the proverbial coffin, the UK has experienced a sharp decline in productivity over the past few decades, which has significantly impacted its economic growth and industrial base. In the years following World War II, Britain was a major industrial power, producing steel, automobiles, and textiles at competitive levels. Today, much of that industry has vanished, and the productivity gains seen in other developed economies have eluded the UK. One of the most troubling trends is the stagnation in productivity growth. Productivity, defined as output per hour worked, has grown at an abysmally slow rate since the financial crisis of 2008. Before the crisis, UK productivity grew at an average of 2% per year, but since then, growth has barely surpassed 0.5% annually. This is often referred to as the productivity puzzle because economists have struggled to fully explain why the UK lags so far behind other advanced economies like Germany, France, and the United States. Several factors contribute to this problem. One is the lack of investment in infrastructure and innovation. British firms have underinvested in new technologies and equipment that could boost worker efficiency, and a lot of that stems from the pressure put on businesses by the overbearing government. The decline in productivity is closely linked to the decay of Britain's industrial base. The UK's share of manufacturing output has steadily fallen, shrinking from around 25% of the GDP in the 1970s to less than 10% today. This deindustrialization has left many regions of the country, particularly in the North and Midlands, economically stagnant and socially distressed. This section is closely linked to the energy crisis we talked about earlier. Taking again the British steel industry as an example, the government's decision to phase out coal and other traditional energy sources has made it prohibitively expensive for British steelmakers to operate. The high cost of electricity and stringent environmental regulations have led to the closure of many steel plants, and the country now imports most of its steel from abroad. For instance, British Steel, once the pride of the industry, was forced into liquidation in 2019. The reason for the low rise of worker productivity is very closely linked to deindustrialization. If we think about it, it is much easier to increase the productivity of workers working in industry and agriculture through the purchase or invention of new and better machines and or production methods than it is to increase the productivity of the service sector, where the output of workers like servers, baristas, or retail workers is largely fixed. The UK's challenges are not just isolated issues, they are interconnected, forming a web of problems that feed into each other. The energy crisis exacerbates industrial decline, which in turn amplifies unemployment and regional inequality. The housing crisis makes it harder for families to afford homes, while stagnant productivity and a weakened industrial base limit economic growth and job creation. At the same time, the effects of Brexit, an aging population, and mass immigration make it almost impossible to recover and revitalize the nation. All of these factors have culminated in a society that feels like it's stuck in a downward spiral, the end of an empire, so to say. The quality of life for many British citizens is in decline, and without meaningful reforms, the future looks increasingly uncertain. But it's not too late. A comprehensive strategy, one that addresses these interlinked crises, could potentially turn things around. But without swift action, the gap between Britain's past prosperity and its present struggles will continue to widen. If you're a British citizen, please share your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you found this video insightful, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Beyond Economics for more deep dives into critical economic and social issues impacting nations worldwide. Your support helps bring more content like this to life. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.